This is Thomas Wayne Riley, and you have found yourself in the American Southwest. This is part 5 of my series over Billy the Kid and the Lincoln County War. The backcountry idea of order rested upon an exceptionally strong sense of self-sovereignty. Something of the same principle had also existed in Tidewater, Virginia, where the gentry were fond of quoting the Old English cliché that every man's home was his castle. But the people of the backcountry went a step further. A North Carolina proverb declared that every man should be sheriff on his own hearth. This idea implied not only individual autonomy, but autarky. Further, it narrowly circumscribed the role of government, for if man were sheriff on his own hearth, then there was not very much work for a county sheriff to do, except to patrol the roads that lay in between. There were official sheriffs and constables throughout that region, but the heaviest work of order keeping was done by ad hoc groups of self-appointed agents who called themselves regulators in the 18th century, vigilantes in the 19th, and night riders in the 20th. That quote was by David Hackett Fisher in his 1989 book, Albion Seed, 4 British Folkways in America. Eventually, McSween, Brewer, and the late Tunstall faction of men opposing the House would go by the name of the Regulators. But where on earth did they get that name? It turns out, Regulators, the name, has a long and storied history and tradition in this nation. In April of 2025, a friend who goes by the alias Closington of the Mingo Creek Society of Western Pennsylvania, he published an enormous article for the Old Glory Club in which he extensively covered the Whiskey Rebellion of 1791 to 1794. It was a long read, but a fantastic one. In the article, he talks at length about the so-called regulators of the early frontiers, before and shortly after this nation was born. At that time, many groups of men came together to fight off Indian attacks, tax collectors, and land speculators who were buying up huge chunks of land in order to sell later for a profit. This was land that these men and their families were sometimes living on. Closington talks about this and wrote, quote, "In the backcountry, the militias that fought off Indian raids were not funded with debt. They were manned by poor farmers who banded together in ad hoc posses. The wealthy and populated Atlantic coast might have funded their fancy standing armies with debt, but the backwoods did not have such sophisticated logistical or financial apparatuses. The Appalachian frontier was a hotbed for self-proclaimed regulator posses and home to dozens of self-proclaimed independent Scots-Irish states, associations, and self-governing communities unaccountable to higher centralized authorities. Before and after the American Revolution. In an attempt to self-police communities, vigilante posses occasionally proliferated in an attempt to correct or self-regulate legal injustices imposed on the backcountry by corrupt officials or, on occasion, to reject or nullify laws imposed on communities by faraway authorities." End quote. Can you see the connection between the regulators of Lincoln County and these that came 100 years before? The similarities continue between the eastern colonial states and the territory of New Mexico. Closington continues, quote, "Land agents would take money from frontier farmers for land purchases but would not register the deed titles at the Colonial Land Office. Tax collectors were also known to pocket the taxes they collected from frontiersmen and report the farmer's tax status as unpaid. The corrupt land agents and tax collectors were often in cahoots with colonial administrators and judges who would side with their friends over poor farmers when the fraud cases were presented in court. End quote. Sounds a lot like the Santa Fe ring and the Dolan Murphy house. Some of these old-timey regulators would often fight back with violence, looting, burning, and even public tar and feathering. It was a way for a people without the means or the backing of the state to fight back against corruption in a system that made it profitable to be corrupt. Shays' Rebellion, Eli's Rebellion, and finally, the Whiskey Rebellion, they were all led by self-proclaimed regulators who were fighting back against the system that was stacked against them. Now, the regulators of Lincoln County were carrying on the tradition some 100 years later and far to the southwest. The house sold land they had no title to, and would often take back the land and everything on it if the frontiersmen missed a payment. The house hired thieves and rustlers to further their stocks and profits, which they would then use to sell to the Santa Fe ring and the military, and the Apache. The Santa Fe ring put in place a corrupt judge in Mesilla, and the house put a corrupt sheriff in Lincoln. And the district attorney were in cahoots with both the house and the ring. The house was backed by the even more corrupt Santa Fe ring, so the courts were seemingly of no use. The law was not on your side if you opposed the house. The deck was stacked against you. Betting against the house, as we have seen, could mean financial ruin or death. The regulators of Lincoln County were the people's answer to the house and the Santa Fe ring. In mid-March, the Mesilla Valley Independent wrote this of what was happening in Lincoln County. Quote, "It is a misfortune for a county to lose confidence in the courts. Men are disposed to take the law into their own hands when they are forced to feel that the courts cannot be depended upon to mete out even-handed justice to its violators. This is an evil, but 1 degree less than the failure of the courts to administer the criminal law, and is to be deprecated under any circumstances, but the most urgent and extreme. It is a terrible alternative, and all that can be said in its behalf is that the mob law is better than no law. But when the public has reason to lose confidence in its courts and jurors, and to realize that life and property are not guarded as thoroughly as they should be, the deposition to execute justice without the leave or authority of law is natural and inevitable, however to be deplored." End quote. What are the people of a place to do when the law and the courts are corrupt and no reprieve can be found among them? Eventually, you must band together and regulate. You must become regulators. In Maurice Fulton's A History of the Lincoln County War, he states, quote, "A few days before McSween's departure from Lincoln," which is what I finished the last episode on, but a few days before McSween's departure from Lincoln, what was virtually a vigilante organization sprang up, calling itself Regulators. As Brady seemed disinclined to arrest any of those implicated in the murder, Brewer and 8 or 10 others banded themselves together for that undertaking. Some were actuated by genuine friendship for Tunstall, this being the case with his employees such as Brewer, Waite, Billy the Kid, and Middleton. Frank McNabb, employed as a cattle detective by such large stock owners as the firm of Hunter and Evans, was quick to join forces with anyone declaring war on the cattle rustlers. Others, like Doc Scurlock, Charlie Beaudry, Henry Brown, Sam Smith, and Jim French, were moved by grudges against the Dolan firm. End quote. They wouldn't be called the Regulators publicly or in print until about 2 months from this time right now in the story. But that Mesilla Valley Independent article would have quite a bit to do with their name finally being printed. Well, that and what's about to happen in Lincoln. Fulton further describes the organization of the Regulators, although I'm really not sure where he got this information. But it's a nice story regardless of if it's true or not, so I'll read it anyways. He wrote, quote, "They unified their organization by an oath requiring each to stick to the other no matter what might happen. To offset any untoward effect on public opinion, They announced that they would not execute summary justice on those they might arrest, but would merely take them into custody and deliver them at Lincoln to be held for trial at the next term of court, then only 4 or 5 weeks off. As a further precaution against being misunderstood, they disavowed strongly any connection with the wrangle over the Fritz money. That, they said, was McSween's private affairs, not theirs. They were, so they averred, the champions of justice, so openly and flagrantly being flaunted by county officials sworn to uphold it, and did not intend to be drawn into any collateral commotions. Such at least was the spirit in which the organization was conceived. End quote. That last line is pretty important. Such at least was the spirit in which the organization was conceived. Because it won't stay overtly just for too long, unfortunately. But what plays out next absolutely adds some sympathy to the plight of the men known as the Regulators. But not just for them, also for all of the people of Lincoln County. As I mentioned in a previous episode, William H. Bonney, aka Billy the Kid, he was an avid dime novel reader, and it is extremely likely that he not only took the alias Bonney, but that he created the name The Regulators by borrowing it from Edward Bonney's The Banditti of the Prairies. In that story, a group of regulators seek justice on the plains. Another book that had been published a year before these events, in 1877, that book was by Edward L. Wheeler, and it was titled A Tale of the Regulators and Road Agents of the Black Hills. In that book, which William Bonney the Kid probably read in Tunstall store, the author Wheeler writes, quote, "Regulators strike blows in defense of justice." End quote. That is exactly what the Regulators of Lincoln County were planning on doing. I finished the previous episode with a newcomer to the story, the British man Montague Leverson. He had just written a letter to the British ambassador over the murder of Tunstall. Well, he would not stop there. On his way to Chisholm's ranch to meet with McSween, he would send off even more letters from Roswell. He had written a general, a senator from Rhode Island, the President of the United States, and the Secretary of the Interior, Carl Schurz, who is the same man who deputized Weidman as a U.S. Marshal. He sent this newest batch of letters on Monday, March 25th, 1878. In the letter to the Secretary of State, he wrote that the territory of New Mexico was in the hands of a quote-unquote gang of veritable thieves. He explained in that letter that it was not the Hispanic or Mexican element. It was the American, or rather more precise, Leverson the Englishman blamed the Irish, meaning Murphy, Dolan, and Riley. No relation. By Thursday, March 28, 1878, the bubbling volcano Leverson described in those letters blew its top. The Presbyterian minister Ely, who had recently arrived to town with his family and who was staying at the McSweens, he wrote about that morning in his journal and said, quote, "At 9 a.m., firing began downtown. I went up on the house top to see what it meant. I was shot at. Did not see who did it, but I know it was one of 3 men." End quote. The following morning, the same scene played out again. And Ely wrote of it yet again, quote, "We heard rapid firing downtown, and our house being flat-roofed, I ran up to get a view of the town and discover, if possible, what was going on. And before I could discover what it meant, someone shot at me from a house nearby. And my friend Weidman was shot at standing upon the ground in front of the house a few minutes later. Afterwards, we learned that the firing began at Stockton's saloon, and that a young man had been shot through the shoulder." End quote. Unfortunately, and kind of incredibly, it is unknown to this day who fired those shots, and it's amazing no one was killed. But since Weidman and the preacher were both fired at, it's pretty safe to assume the assailants were of the Dolan House faction. In early April, the Englishman Leverson would send yet another letter to the President of the United States, Rutherford B. Hayes. In this letter, he would describe how on March 30th, a Saturday, he described how it became the third day in a row of violence in Lincoln. This time, the violence involved William H. Bonney, a.k.a. Billy the Kid, and his buddy Waite, who, if you'll recall, had had their constabulary reissued, so they were technically lawmen again. Lawmen and regulators. This violence involved the crooked Sheriff Brady's deputy, George Pepin. I will now quote the author of Billy the Kid, The Life Behind the Legend, George R. Matthews. And he also quotes from Leverson's letter. In a letter written on April 2nd to President Hayes, Montague Leverson described the incident. Quote, "A few days ago, one of the constables who had been deputed by Justice Wilson to arrest the murderers of Mr. Tunstall rode into town in company with a young boy about 16. Pepin called to the constable to stop, as he had a warrant to arrest him." End quote. But Waite knew that was not true and called Pepin's bluff. "All right, come and read it to me." Pepin's answer, and that of his ruffians with him, was a volley from revolvers and rifles. End quote. Spurring their horses forward and returning fire, quote, "The two boys turned on them and the 7 fled." End quote. Leverson did not recognize young Bonney, whom he had taken for a 16-year-old boy, and who had also been a deputy constable. Miraculously, not a drop of blood was shed during the encounter. End all quotes. While all of this random, or maybe not so random, shooting was going on in Lincoln, before Deputy Pepin had confronted Waite and William Bonney the Kid, Sheriff Brady had attempted to gather a posse of Lincoln residents, who again, Lincoln residents are mostly New Mexican Hispanics. Well, when the sheriff attempted to gather a posse to ride out to Chisholm's ranch to arrest McSween and his protector, the Frenchman Deputy Sheriff Adolphe Barrier of San Miguel County, no one joined him. In Lincoln, absolutely nobody in town was willing to ride with the crooked sheriff to arrest McSween or any of the regulators. So the sheriff threatened to fine the men $50 each if they didn't ride with him. The Lincoln residents' reply, according to Leverson's letter to the president, quote, "Well, when we get the $50, we will pay it. But if you call on us to go in pursuit of the murderers of Mr. Tunstall, we will go at once." End quote. The Lincolnites had had enough of the House and of their Black Knight, Sheriff Brady. With no other options, Brady went to Fort Stanton and gathered a posse of soldiers. He did have the authority to do this, according to the Santa Fe Ring, the governor, and the president, if you'll recall. When Brady arrived at Chisholm's ranch with the soldiers, Brady was angered that there were no Deputy Barrier or McSween to be found. So they had gotten word of the troops and the sheriff's impending arrival, and they had fled to a place I know and love. They'd gone a little southeast from the ranch towards a place called Bottomless Lakes. It's now a state park, and it's an awesome place. It was one of the first places I ever went to in New Mexico. The lakes aren't actually bottomless, but they are pretty deep. One is 90 feet, which for how small the holes are is pretty deep, so they do appear bottomless. They're essentially cenotes, or sinkholes, and each one of them is a beautiful color on account of aquatic plants. I'll have pictures at the site for this episode. If you're ever near Roswell, you should check them out. Just know it is quite hot in the summertime. But one of the larger lakes has a beach where you can swim at to cool you down. I camped at the lakes for a second time in 2012, and I saw the then President of the United States, a man not worth mentioning, but I saw Air Force One take off from the Roswell Airport with all the accompanying helicopters and fighter jets. It was pretty neat. 2 years later, I sat above the lakes as a tornado spawning supercell towering storm. This storm took over the western horizon and slowly came barreling my way. It was breathtaking and a little hair-raising. But back to our story. McSween and Barrier were at the Bottomless Lakes after having gotten word of their impending arrest. At Chisholm's, Brady apologized for the numerous armed and ready soldiers accompanying him and said that he, quote, regretted having to come with troops, but that the citizens of Lincoln had refused to accompany him, end quote. Gee, I wonder why no one would join him. But while McSween was not there, his wife Susan had returned from St. Louis and was at the ranch. Chisholm had also been released from jail, so he was finally back at home. The Englishman Leverson was also there, as well as Chisholm's two brothers. The military leader who had accompanied Brady was a man named Lieutenant Smith. Smith had fought the 3 major campaigns in Georgia during the war as a Yankee. He then quit the Army, only to rejoin again 7 years later. He was now at Fort Stanton, and it seems he genuinely wanted peace in the county. He pleaded with McSween's wife for McSween to turn himself in. He was quoted as giving his, quote, word as an officer and a gentleman that if McSween did so, he would not be placed in jail or in the guardhouse, end quote. He then told Miss McSween personally that, quote, you may make a football of my head if a hair of his head be injured or if the least insult be given him by word or sign from the highest to the lowest, end quote. He also again told her that McSween would not be arrested by anyone, especially Brady. Miss McSween took his word and promised to pass it on to her husband and the sheriff deputy. From what I can tell, this Yankee Lieutenant Smith never intended on keeping his word. He never intended to keep McSween safe. It seems he always wanted for McSween to be arrested by Brady. And I say this because as soon as Brady and Smith and the soldiers reached Lincoln after leaving Chisholm's ranch, Smith headed right back for Fort Stanton. He did this despite also promising Susan McSween that her husband would be escorted to the fort by Smith himself. McSween and his wife, though, did in fact take Smith at his word, and McSween decided to head to Lincoln to deal with the consequences of this growing and ever more deadly war. Accompanying McSween and his wife were Chisholm, the Englishman Leverson, and a few others from the ranch. Not accompanying them was Deputy Sheriff Brady. He headed back home to Las Vegas, where he would be arrested. No charges would be filed against him, though, for harboring and saving the life of McSween, at least for a while. A vicious rainstorm stalled the McSween group and their 2 wagons, so they didn't arrive on Sunday as planned. But during the evening, when it became clear as they watched the soldiers leave and Brady prepare for McSween's arrival, it became clear to the Regulators at McSween's home that as soon as he arrived, he would be handcuffed or killed. So probably under the guidance of Middleton, since Dick Brewer was absent, Middleton devised a plan with Brown, French, Waite, and William Bonney the Kid to assassinate the corrupt Sheriff Brady. His time had come, and they were not going to let McSween, another one of their men, die by this man's orders or negligence. The following morning, April 1st, in the muddy street of Lincoln, Sheriff Brady, along with 4 deputies, Deputies Hindman, Matthews, Pepin, and Long, the 5 of them walked eastward from the Dolan house to McSween's. Only Brady approached the house, though, and as he did so, the wife of the aforementioned Sheriff Ham Mills met Sheriff Brady in the street. After some talking and laughing, Brady walked east to catch up with his 4 other deputies who had continued walking. They made it to the Tunstall store where Minister Ely recorded that he heard gunfire erupt. I will now let Matthews describe what happened next. Quote, at that moment, Ely heard a volley of gunfire and saw Brady and Hindman fall. Hit in the head, left side and back, Brady died almost instantly. Lying in the mud, Hindman called out for water. Ike Stockton ran from his saloon in the west end of Jose Montano's store into the street, got Hyman to his feet, and began to help him toward the saloon. But Hyman was hit a second time and fell dead. Pepin, Long, and Matthews ran back up the street to take refuge in the nearby Cisneros house, opposite McSween's house and the Tunstall store. Bonney and French ran out into the street from behind the tall wooden gate opening into the corral at the rear northeastern corner of the store. Bonney picked up his Winchester rifle from the mud beside Brady's dead body, the one Brady had taken from him when Brady had disarmed and marched him, Waite and Martinez, to the pit jail. French probably accompanied Bonnie to provide protection. As Bonnie grabbed the Winchester, one of the men in the Cisneros house, probably Matthews, opened fire. French was hit in the left thigh, but quickly retreated with Bonnie, who was unhurt, to the safety of the corral. End quote. So the corrupt sheriff and ex-Yankee soldier Brady lay dead in the street not far from his deputy Heineman. Immediately after French and William Bonnie the Kid reached the corral, the Kid leapt up on his horse, and he, Middleton, Brown, and Waite took off down the street and to the east, towards the many mountains that lay between Lincoln and the Pecos River Valley. They hadn't gone far, though, when 3 of Brady's deputies began to shoot at them from the middle of the street after they'd left their cover. Middleton, almost out of town, jumped off his horse, got to one knee, and returned fire. Both parties were shooting at one another, but no one else was hit. Eventually, Middleton hopped back on his horse and took off after his Regulator comrades. French, meanwhile, stumbled into the McSween house to have the minister and physician Ely dress the bullet hole in his thigh. Ely patched the man up, and then Corbett, who often ran the Tunstall store, tore up some floorboards in Tunstall's room at the store and hid the man on a blanket on the ground under the store. Corbett also gave French 2 pistols. If you visit the Tunstall store today, you can see where the boards have been pulled up. At least I'm pretty sure it's that spot. French was eventually taken to a hole-in-the-wall house that was practically invisible to the naked eye, somewhere in the mountains where he recovered for 3 weeks. Billy the Kid, Middleton, and Waite rode hard for Dick Brewer's ranch, where he'd been for the last 3 weeks. They told him all that had happened in the intervening time, and especially of their assassination of the corrupt Sheriff Brady on his way to arrest McSween. It seems Brewer, at some point in the intervening days, accepted the story, accepted the reasoning, and accepted the leadership of the Regulators. George R. Matthews, in his exceptional book, writes, quote, "Brewer became a Regulator because he viewed them, not as outlaws, but as aggrieved citizens seeking justice for Tunstall's murderers. He knew that McSween and Wadman expected the British ambassador in Washington to request the American government to investigate the murder of Tunstall, a British subject, and must have believed a federal investigation would find the actions of the Regulators justified, including the killing of the corrupt Sheriff Brady and his deputy George Heineman, in order to save McSween's life." End quote. Brewer would not live long enough to see the remainder of the Regulators, especially Billy the Kid, become a true hardened killer and outlaw. But for the moment, Brewer believed in the Regulators and their cause, and he was willing to fight to see justice done in Lincoln. Regulators strike blows in the defense of justice. Dolan, at least it was most likely Dolan, but someone spread a rumor immediately after Sheriff Brady's murder that he was killed while on his way to post a bulletin, not to arrest McSween. Sure, he needed 4 armed deputies when he posted the notice, but maybe they were just on edge, so they walked together as 5 armed lawmen to post a notice just in case. I mean, it turns out the firepower was necessary, but in the end, it didn't do Brady or Heineman any good. But oops, when he died, Brady had a pair of handcuffs in his pocket, as well as the arrest warrant for McSween. So it's pretty safe to say he was on his way to see if McSween had arrived yet, and if he had, Brady was going to throw him in the pit jail and probably see that he got some extra judicious murder. Despite Lieutenant Smith's murder, that no harm would come to him. Something about turning his head into a football. Before Brady's body was even cold, Deputy Pepin took the arrest warrant out of the dead sheriff's pocket, handed it to one of his men, and told the man to race to Fort Stanton and let the army know they needed men in the town fast. Before long, Captain Purrington and Lieutenant Smith had arrived with 25 mounted and armed troopers. At the same time the troopers were arriving, McSween, his wife, Chisholm, and Leverson, as well as the rest of their party, arrived on the eastern edge of town. And that's when they learned of the killings. Before they could be apprehended, though, the Englishman Leverson sent another quick letter to President Hayes. In it, he wrote, quote, "2 more of Mr. Tunstall's murderers have been killed, viz. the sheriff who employed the ruffians in his posse and a noted cattle thief who was also one of the sheriff's deputies on the occasion of Mr. Tunstall's murder." He then added, quote, "More bloodshed will follow unless the governor be at once removed. He is the mainstay of the thieves and murderers." End quote. He was close. It wasn't just the governor, but also his bosses, the Catrone and Elkins Santa Fe ring. As soon as the captain and the lieutenant arrived, Deputy Pepin led them to McSween's, where they promptly arrested Wideman, David Shield, McSween's business partner and brother-in-law, and McSween's 2 black employees, yet again. Why were they all arrested? Well, for the murder of Brady and Heineman, of course. From McSween's house, the party then walked to the eastern edge of town where they found McSween. McSween's first reaction, since he was a gifted lawyer after all, was, "Why are you with Deputy Pepin? His authority as a deputy died with Brady." Nobody was having it, though, and eventually McSween agreed to be escorted to the fort's jailhouse without a fight. But first, they stopped at McSween's house, where the army and the ex still acting as deputy, Pepin, gathered up the other 4 prisoners and began to march them out. Then Pepin stopped Captain Purrington and asked if he could search the McSween's house for firearms. McSween objected, and the Englishman Leverson, who was still with them, asked if they had a search warrant. Purrington's response was, quote, "No, Pepin asked me if he could search, and I told him he could do as he pleased." End quote. Clearly, despite Purrington's earlier objections to this whole affair, he had become a Dolan House man. When Leverson and McSween objected again to the search, Leverson reminded Purrington that he needed a search warrant according to the Constitution of the United States. Purrington angrily yelled back, quote, "Damn the Constitution and you for an ass." End quote. I would expect nothing less from a Yankee. I'm joking. But that really is quite a turnaround from questioning the whole legality of this military use in civilian tyrannical affairs to bellowing, "Damn the Constitution." Leverson, according to Maurice Fulton, responded with, quote, "God knows, I would not live in a country where such outrages as these I have witnessed this afternoon are countenanced." End quote. Purrington's response, quote, "Sir, you have my permission to suit yourself." End quote. And again, I'm not sure on the 100% validity of all of the stories in Fulton's book, but I do like that interchange, so I added it. There were no weapons found in the house, which is not surprising since McSween constantly said he didn't need to be armed. After the illegal search, the 5 prisoners were escorted by Purrington and Smith and the 25 troopers back to Fort Stanton. In tow were McSween's wife and Leverson, although Miss McSween would only stay a day at the fort. 3 of the 5 prisoners would be released a week later on April 8th. Those 3 would be McSween, Wideman, and David Shield, McSween's business partner and brother-in-law. The 2 Negroes who worked for McSween would be sent to quote-unquote territorial services. So they were only briefly they were used by the same army that claimed to have freed them just a decade prior. During McSween's first night in jail, he, of course, wrote a lengthy letter which was sent to and published in the Cimarron News and Press. He basically outlined all that had happened so far, including the murders, the corruption, the theft, and the grievances brought upon them illegally by the governor. The letter ended with, quote, "Where will all these troubles end? The people have waited patiently for legal redress. But this failing, our horses and cattle being stolen so that we can make no crops, the people's patience has given way in violence, and the end cannot be predicted." End quote. Indeed, the end is unpredictable. But along the way, there are also a lot of unforeseen twists and turns. Only a few days after the murder of Sheriff Brady, the Regulators under Brewer had nearly tripled in size and now numbered 12 angry men. men who had grown tired of the house. Men who felt as if the odds were now in their favor. Men who were quickly giving way to violence. The new men included Ignacio Gonzalez, John Scroggins, Dirty Steve Stevens, Frank Coe, George Coe, Doc Scurlock, and Charlie Beaudry. Some of those names I've mentioned before, mostly in passing. On Wednesday, the 3rd of April, 1878, these regulators were on their way to dispense more justice. The following is a bit of a whirlwind, and it involves a bunch of names that would be lost to your memory in this story already filled with names, so I'll keep it brief. Essentially, the regulators were most likely heading to Shedd's Ranch, that den of thieves on the other side of the Tularosa Basin, where a few stories during this saga have already taken place. Shedd's Ranch is the outlaw stop on the other side of the White Sands at the base of the Oregon Mountains. On their way, though, the 12 regulators stopped at a well-known destination for travelers known as Blazer's Mill. They stopped to have a bite to eat. Blazer's Mill was located in a small town known as South Fork, and the mill housed the Mescalero Indian agent for the federal government. The current Mescalero Indian agent for the federal government was a man named Fred Godfrey. Godfrey was a member of the Santa Fe Ring. Therefore, he was in with the house in Lincoln. Now that I've explained that, I will let Matthews further describe what happens next. Quote, Frank Coe, the first to finish eating, stepped outside and saw Andrew Roberts, carrying his rifle, walking toward the house. Roberts, a member of the posse that had killed Tunstall, was one of the men Brewer hoped to capture. But Roberts and Brewer's simultaneous arrival at South Fork was an unfortunate coincidence. Coe, who knew Roberts as Bill Williams, was on friendly terms with his Rio Ruidoso ranching neighbor. The two men met, shook hands, and at Coe's invitation, walked around the house to sit on the uncovered porch on the west side of the building, where Coe tried to get Roberts to surrender. Roberts had sold his place on the Rio Ruidoso and was leaving Lincoln County. He had stopped at Blazer's Mill earlier to pick up the check from the buyer of his property, which had been mailed to him at the South Fork Post Office, located in the rear northwest corner room of the agency house. It had not arrived. But Dr. Blazer, South Fork's postmaster, promised to forward it. Roberts had left, but a short distance down valley he had met the mailman and followed him back to South Fork in case he carried the check. End quote. See, there was no way for me to give this story justice by combining the sources and putting it into my own words. It's rather convoluted, which I have found more recent stories tend to be. It's easy for me to write up a narrative and story when very little is written about it. I'm able to use my vivid imagination and those instances and fill in the narrative gaps that weren't written down. So when I find a great author that is able to sum up a story nicely, I tend to rely on them. All right, that's my justification for so many Matthews quotes. So Coe knew Roberts, who had been with the posse that killed Tunstall. Roberts was about to leave town but decided, no, I'd rather have that check now. Brewer and the regulators saw Roberts and recognized him. Instead of a gunfight, Brewer sent out Frank Coe. Matthews continues the story and explains the Wild West-style shootout that occurs in what's become known as the fight at Blazer's Mill. Quote, Frank Coe later remembered he had talked with Roberts for half an hour. I begged him to surrender, but the answer was no, no, no. Presently, Charlie Beaudry in the lead, with John Middleton and George Coe, came around the corner of the building. Beaudry yelled, Roberts, throw up your hands. Roberts screamed, no. He rose and, quote, brought up his gun and shot from his hip with his Winchester, and Beaudry shot him through from one side to the other. The dust flew from his clothes from both sides. End all quotes. George Coe, cousin to Frank Coe, he took the errant shot from Robert's rifle. He would later say of the incident that the bullet ricocheted off of Beaudry's ammo belt and, quote, with my usual luck, I arrived just in time to stop the bullet with my right hand, It knocked the gun out of my hand, took off my trigger finger, and shattered my hand. End quote. With my usual luck. I mean, how often are you in shootouts where you lose your trigger finger? George Coe must have had a rough life up to this point. Although he did give this account much later. Still, while death was involved, it's a darkly humorous story. Despite Roberts taking a bullet that tore through his body, he continued to stagger on his feet backwards, firing the whole time, until he reached another building at Blazer's Mill. One of those bullets he shot while retreating actually hit Middleton in the chest. A few stories mention that Billy the Kid took a grazing shot as well. Frank Coe, the Coe who still had his trigger finger, he later said of the injured Roberts, quote, "I never saw a man that could handle a Winchester as fast as he could." End quote. As Roberts was approaching the other and newer Blazer's Mill building where Blazer had his office, he had fired his last shot. Now, in Gardner's To Hell on a Fast Horse, Gardner claims at this point Billy, knowing Roberts was out of ammo, ran at the man to kill him, but Roberts pushed Billy away before he slipped into the small building. I'm not sure if that's true, as I don't know the source. Regardless, after reaching the house, Roberts, the man who had been in the posse that had killed Tunstall and the man who had a warrant for his arrest and who had just taken a bullet, he put the front door to, backed into the room, and then noticed the silver-mounted .45-60 Springfield hunting rifle that belonged to the Blazer of Blazer's Mill. He noticed the beautiful rifle hanging on the wall, and next to it was a box of shells. Roberts threw the mattress in the room on the floor, and he laid himself upon it as he stared out the crack in the door with the beautiful and deadly weapon he'd just acquired. Gardner writes that Roberts had, before all of this, been a buffalo hunter on the Great Plains. Gardner writes, quote, "It was said he had worked with Buffalo Bill Cody in the late 1860s, supplying bison meat to railroad crews in western Kansas." End quote. Gardner goes on to describe the gun. Quote, "Dr. Blazer Springfield was a special officer's model, equipped with a Tang peep sight for precision shooting at long distances, and Roberts knew how to handle such a weapon." End quote. Not a single regulator approached the cabin, which held the man who was adept at firing a rifle, even with the through-and-through bullet wound through his midsection. Brewers demanded that the justice of the peace of the nearby town, who also happened to be at the restaurant that evening, Brewer demanded that he bring Roberts out. But the lawmen refused and pleaded with Brewer's men to forget the whole thing and to get out of there. Brewer refused to leave, and he responded that he would, quote, "have that man out if he had to pull the house down." End quote. Justifiably angry and longing for vengeance, Brewer ran around the cabin in a circuitous route, crossing a bridge over a trickle of water as he did so. And then he took up a position on the other side of the prone Roberts within the cabin behind a pile of logs. In this position, Brewer had a shot at Roberts. Brewer took that shot, but he missed. Roberts turned around to where the shot came from, and after a moment, he took his own. According to Frank Coe, when Dick Brewer, the leader of the Regulators, rose to fire again, Roberts pulled the trigger, and the bullet, quote, "just shaved the log and hit Brewer right in the eye and knocked the top of his head off at 125 steps away." End quote. At this point, Brewer was dead, and Roberts was bleeding out. The volcano was erupting in Lincoln County, and the ash was spreading everywhere. After Brewer's death, the author Mark Lee Gardner has Billy the Kid angrily confronting Dr. Blazer and telling him he would kill the man if Blazer didn't get Roberts out of the house. When Blazer refused, Gardner says that Billy then threatened to burn Blazer's house down. Now that may have happened, but I don't know the source, and it isn't quoted anywhere else. Then you've got Matthews Everything he writes has a well-documented and cited source. Much of Billy's life, after all, is legend and probably inflated to prove how violent and wild he was. Whether Billy rushed Roberts and then later confronted Blazer or not, it doesn't change the fact that the leader of the Regulators was missing the crown of his skull and had joined Tunstall in the next great adventure. After the shootout, the injured Middleton was led to the stream which Brewer had crossed to assault Roberts. Middleton drank liberally from the cold water as he nursed his chest wound with the help of Frank Coe. George Coe's hand was shattered and bleeding. Neither George Coe nor Middleton could easily ride back to Lincoln, which was now their destination after their mission had been blown to smithereens by Andrew Roberts. Brewer's dead body was left where he fell, and the Regulators slowly rode back. Meanwhile, the Indian agent Godfrey quickly sent word to Fort Stanton for their surgeon, the same one that had betrayed the death report on Tunstall. This guy's name was Appel. Godfrey sent word for him to help the dying Roberts. On the road, though, Appel saw to Middleton and George Coe before continuing on to the mill. In Frederick Nolan's The West of Billy the Kid, he would write of Roberts, quote, "Beaudry's bullet had entered just above the left hip bone and ranged downward through the groin. There was nothing Appel could do for him." End quote. Roberts would die around noon the following day. A resident of the small community of South Fork who witnessed the shootout, after the fracas had died down and after Roberts had bled out, he built a large coffin in which both Brewer and Roberts were placed side by side. Many of the Regulators returned to their homes after the shootout, but Middleton, Brown, Waite, and Bonnie the Kid headed to another small collection of houses known as San Patricio. In the small town, these four most likely stayed at the home of fellow Regulator Ignacio Gonzalez. The little town's constable, Jose Chavez y Chavez, would meet with the five Regulators before he himself would join the band of righteous outlaws. He would notably, though, stay on as San Patricio's legal constable. Over in Lincoln, Chisholm, Miss McSween, and the minister Ely were at McSween's with a Las Vegas businessman named Calvin Simpson when they all got the news that Brewer had been killed. At Fort Stanton, because he had yet to be released, McSween himself heard the news and immediately penned an article for the Cimarron News and Press. In the article, he wrote of Brewer. He said, quote, "Richard M. Brewer was one of nature's noblemen, physically faultless, generous to a fault, a giant in friendship, possessing an irreproachable character and unsullied honor, kind, amiable, and gentle in disposition. Outside the Murphy-Dolan-Riley faction, no one knew Mr. Brewer but to respect him. He was a young man without vices of any kind. Murderers and horse thieves hated him. Their friends hated him. But the people, Mexicans and Americans, held him in the highest possible esteem. He had a fine ranch on the Rio Ruidoso, which he had been cultivating the past 4 years. It was his intention to make Lincoln County his permanent home." End quote. He finished the article with, quote, "Peace to your ashes, Dick, as you were familiarly called. Sweet and pleasant be your slumbers, evergreen and fresh be your memory. Some will malign you, but that will not disturb you, for when the mist has cleared away and the horizon of truth is clearly seen, even they will be shamed to silence. Death has deprived your father and mother of an obedient and loving son, your sister and brother of the Prince of Brothers, the county of Lincoln of one of her best, most industrious, sober, upright, and honest citizens." End quote. 150 residents of Lincoln signed an in memoriam that McSween penned in which he wrote, quote, "We, the undersigned residents of Lincoln County in the territory of New Mexico, deeply deplore the loss our county sustains by the death of Richard M. Brewer, a young man of irreproachable character, who commanded the respect and admiration of all who knew him. Some of us have been acquainted with him over 8 years, and none ever knew his name to be associated with anything of a questionable character. He was a hard-working, generous, sober, upright, and noble-minded young man. End quote. Not only did the Regulators lose a leader, but the entire town and county of Lincoln lost an honest and courageous man. How many more lives will the Lincoln County War claim? Henry McCarty, a.k.a. Henry Antrim, a.k.a. William Bonney, or Billy the Kid. He had only been working in Lincoln for 5 months. Brewer had graciously hired him on, without needing the help, which eventually put Billy the Kid on the right side of the law, and as a lawman himself. He met Tunstall, whom he respected, but Tunstall had perished, murdered by these evil men. So Billy became close friends with Brewer, and he owed the man a great debt. But Brewer had perished, murdered by these evil men. That left McSween as a spiritual leader of the Regulators. But he was in jail at Fort Stanton. And before long, he too would go the way of all the earth. Billy's life seemed to be filled with violence and bad luck. In April of 1878, Fort Stanton got a new commanding officer. If you imagined this man being more sympathetic to the Regulators and the people of Lincoln, you'd be wrong. Purrington was sent away, and on April 5th, Lieutenant Colonel Nathan Dudley became the new commanding officer of the fort built to manage the Mescaleros, but was instead quickly becoming involved in Lincoln's troubles. You know, it's rather fitting that the little town named Lincoln was having a small civil war that saw a few righteous men turned outlaws when the corrupt government sought to destroy their way of life. From the Fort Stanton jail, McSween wrote to the new commanding officer and asked for military protection against the Dolan House. He pleaded that if he does not get the protection, he feels, quote, "I will lose my life," end quote. He could not have known now that this very same Lieutenant Colonel Dudley, instead of helping the man, would partially be the cause of McSween losing his own life. The dying of cancer and frail Lawrence Murphy, the founder of the house, he too was writing letters to the commanding officer at Fort Stanton at this time. He still had a few chips to put on the table for his side of the war. He wrote Lieutenant Colonel Dudley and warned that, quote, "It is currently reported here that a party of mounted outlaws are somewhere in the vicinity of Copeland's Ranch in the Ruidoso Valley, where they command the roads, and it is believed to be with a view to capture or kill the judge and members of the court while en route to Fort Stanton or this place. I am advised that the judge and his party will leave Las Cruces today, April 6th. End quote. Basically, Murphy was suggesting the Regulators were en route to kill the corrupt Judge Bristol and the corrupt District Attorney William Reinerson, both of the Santa Fe ring. And this was a complete fabrication. But lying has not stopped the house thus far. Lieutenant Colonel Dudley Do-Right took this letter seriously, though, and he sent a detachment of soldiers to escort Judge Bristol, who was then on his way to Lincoln. And he was on his way because the district court that everyone was waiting on was about to start. Tunstall had been waiting for this court date. McSween was actively waiting for this court date. Chisholm, too. Heck, even Brady had been charged for the theft of Tunstall's hay, and he had his day in court with Judge Bristol as well. Although he would no longer be in attendance, and neither would Tunstall. Everyone, it seems, had a day in this important court, and the corrupt Judge Bristol would be the one to oversee it. It's no wonder the Regulators felt they would not see any justice done, so they had to take matters into their own hands. During this court session, Bristol was escorted to and from the fort to the court in Lincoln by a detachment of soldiers in case anyone tried anything squirrely. which was probably a good idea, although I doubt the regulators would kill a judge, no matter how corrupt he was. Then again, they did kill a sheriff, albeit a sheriff who had it coming. But no, as Matthews writes, quote, Judge Bristol was never in danger. McSween and the regulators looked forward to district court, when McSween expected to be exonerated of his embezzlement charge, and he and the regulators were confident the murderers of Tunstall would be indicted. They must have also believed that the killing of Brady and Hindman could be justified, and no one would be indicted for their deaths. End quote. High hopes. The first thing the judge did was to appoint a new sheriff. Not allow a new election for a new sheriff, but to appoint a new sheriff. So that left a certain John Copeland as acting sheriff of Lincoln County. Sheriff Copeland was a McSween and Regulators partisan. The judge then arranged soldiers from Fort Stanton to accompany acting Sheriff Copeland when he was out doing his duties, like serving warrants. So now the sheriff had help from the military against the regulators, if it came to that. Finally, by April 13th, 11 men of Lincoln County were selected to be the grand jury. And then, amazingly, in an almost identical repeat of the court in Mesilla where corrupt Judge Bristol had railed against the jury and McSween, Judge Bristol yet again went on a lengthy tirade aimed at the jury, which essentially said, you will convict McSween, or else. Even the Cimarron News and Press wrote about how wide-eyed, instead of blind justice, the judge was. They wrote the judge's words were, quote, one of the most partisan charges we ever heard from the bench, and which sounds much more like the argument of an attorney seeking to convict McSween of a crime than the address of a judge before whom the facts are likely to come to trial, and who, from his high office, is presumed to be impartial and disinterested. 3/4 of the charge, occupying 3 columns of the Mesilla Valley Independent, is devoted to an argument seeking to prove A.A. McSween guilty of embezzlement, while a paragraph, less than 1.5 inches in length, is all the space which Judge Bristol can afford to devote to the murder of J.H. Tunstall. End quote. And yet, despite the deck being stacked in favor of the House, McSween was found not guilty of embezzlement. As a matter of fact, the jury wrote, quote, we fully exonerate him of the charge, end quote. They then added, quite incredibly, that they, quote, regret that a spirit of persecution has been shown in this matter, end quote. Meaning the judge had overstepped his bounds when seeking to convict McSween, instead of hearing the case lawfully and impartially. But the jury wasn't done there. And all of this is very exciting, yet very tragic on account of how it all ends. After exonerating McSween, the jury went on to indict George Davis, Manuel Segovia, Deputy John Long, and leaders of the boys, Jesse Evans, for Tunstall's murder. And then the jury indicted as accomplices to the murder Deputy Matthews, and believe it or not, Jimmy Dolan, leader of the House. The jury wrote of the murder that it was, quote, for brutality and malice is without a parallel and without a shadow of justification. By this inhuman act, our county has lost one of our best and most useful men, one who has brought intelligence, industry, and capital to the development of Lincoln County. End quote. I mean, that is incredible. And to top it all off, the murder charges against Deputy U.S. Marshal Weideman, McSween's business partner Shield, and the 2 black employees of McSween were all dropped. But most incredibly of all, the jury indicted, yet again, Dolan and John Riley, the other half of the Dolan-Riley house. They were indicted for cattle theft. But that leaves us with the killing of Sheriff Brady. On that front, news wasn't so great. The jury indicted Middleton, Brown, Waite, and Billy the Kid for the murder of the corrupt sheriff. So the core of the Regulators had murder charges against him. Interestingly, French, who had been shot and who was in hiding, he was not indicted. So that's a win, I guess. Then there's the killing of Andrew Roberts at Blazer's Mill. For that, the jury indicted Charlie Beaudry, the trigger-fingerless George Coe, Doc Scurlock, Stinky Stephen Stevens, and John Scroggins. But it wasn't all bad news. Most of these men expected to be exonerated soon, especially now that word had come down that the Department of Justice and the Department of the Interior were both sending special investigations down to the county to see about Tunstall's murder and the corruption of the House with the Apache and the Indian Agency. And that attention from the federal government was primarily due to McSween's and definitely Leverson's many letters. Leverson, it turns out, Montague Leverson, a decade prior, he had uncovered naturalization fraud and had exposed the scheme in the New York Tribune. Because of his past and his connections, Leverson really did have the Federals looking closely at the situation down in Lincoln. Meanwhile, the new sheriff, Copeland, he completely ignored the indictments of the Regulators. And by now, actually William Bonney, the Kid, had a warrant out for his arrest because he chose to actually honor his court date after the indictment. The other Regulators simply ignored theirs, which had been only a day or two after the indictments. So they didn't go to court. William Bonney the Kid did go to court, and he was indicted. It seems Sheriff Copeland was waiting for the conclusion of these investigations. But again, he was a friend of McSween and the people of Lincoln County. He wanted to see justice as much as anyone in town. So the Regulators were safe. For now. Within an hour after Judge Bristol stormed out of Lincoln, the town residents held a mass gathering in the courthouse led by Juan Patron. Or rather, he called the mass gathering. There were speeches given, resolutions passed, and an absolute condemnation of the governor of the territory of New Mexico was written down. The condemnation said, quote, "We condemn, without qualification, the conduct of our governor, S.B. Axtell, while here in March last. Both his conduct and proclamation of March 9, 1878, are unworthy of an officer filling his exalted station. His refusal to investigate our troubles stamps him as a little one-sided partisan. As a result of that proclamation, he is responsible for the loss of life that has occurred in this county since his visit." End quote. How do you think the Santa Fe ring is going to take those words? The gathered mass also thanked the new commander of Fort Stanton, Dudley, which they would come to regret. They thanked the soldiers as well. And then they thanked themselves. Lastly, they wrote a letter to the Murphy Dolan Riley house, which was no doubt on McSween's behalf. The letter called the house the Irish Firm. The letter asked that the Irish Firm, quote, "for the sake of peace and safety, to leave the county and return no more." End quote. McSween would then post a $5,000 reward for the apprehension and conviction of Tunstall's killers in the Mesilla Valley Independent. He wrote, quote, "I am authorized by J.P. Tunstall of London, England, to offer the above reward for the apprehension and conviction of the murderers of his son, John H. Tunstall, at Lincoln County, New Mexico, on the 18th day of February, 1878. The actual murderers are about 20 in number, and I will pay a proportionate sum for the apprehension and conviction of any of them." End quote. McSween then wrote to one of Tunstall's sisters and said, quote, "There will be no peace here until his murderers have paid the debt." End quote. The tables had turned against the house. Murphy left for Fort Stanton on April 23rd. Dolan was in Santa Fe by May 10th, and Riley moved to Las Cruces. Mick Sween had wiped the house clean, and now he held all the cards. But trouble was building to the east, over in Seven Rivers, where the ex-deputies to the deceased Brady were building an army to avenge the house. The war in Lincoln County had only just begun. Thank y'all for listening, and I'll see you again soon in the American Southwest.
Came down from Alamosa, across the Rio Grande, to track a killer lion, lost his fear, man. First seen around El Rito, he laid a rancher down, killed the rancher's daughter, was gone out of sound. And the purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Not much trace of man out here, the painted canyon walls, the ancient pagan hunters show the chase and fall. Now the lever action rifle and horses change the game, but their ghosts still hunt beside me, the chase still feels the same. And the purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Now the hounds my father left me are ranging out of sight. I stand up in my saddle in the early morning light. I can see the good gyp circle, and I know it won't be long till the canyon rings are striking cry, the lion will be found. Purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Finds a lonely juniper to make his final stand. 3 faithful hounds lie dying, blood shining on the sand. And the good gyp leaps up in the air, as low as murder charge. My rifle cracks, a whisper late, I can feel his iron jaw. The purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Now the eagle sees us falling, the hunter and the prey. His shadow crosses lifeless bodies, where side by side we lay. And the good gyp sits upon the rim, and all alone she cries a death song for her master, killed the mighty lion. Purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Yeah, the purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds.